aren't a lot of video game genres out there that get more exposure than the Metroidvania. Every year, you got indie games coming out the wizzo, all of them trying to recapture the magical sense of exploration and adventure established by a couple juggernauts a few decades ago. Normally, I'd start something like this with a giant lecture about the history of these games, but I'm gonna save that for later. For now, let's dive into the main course. There's a movement of people on the internet who think that game genres shouldn't be named after the games that exemplify them, which is ridiculous. Because honestly, what difference does it make? A genre has exactly two purposes. First, to help consumers find other works in that genre, and two, establish conventions that creators can either follow or subvert in their own work. The name of a genre is under no obligation to sound pretty, nor is it required to describe every single gameplay mechanic included in that genre. That's a complaint you hear all the time when somebody tries to give Metroidvania a so-called legitimate name, and it drives me up a wall. Because find me one genre name on the planet that perfectly encapsulates every single action you perform in the game. The original Doom, for example, actually has a ton of exploration and puzzle solving, but back in the 90s, if a game featured a first-person camera and put a gun in your hand, it was automatically labeled a Doom clone. These days, we refer to games like this as first-person shooters, regardless of any other mechanics you might come across. So despite the fact that Half-Life shares a ton of DNA with point-and-click adventure games, as far as genres are concerned, it's a first-person shooter. Point is, as long as people understand what you're talking about, it doesn't matter what the actual name is. RTS could stand for really tasty snacks for all I cared, and it wouldn't matter as long as there were several other games that had the same mechanics in common. And that's something to keep in mind. Even if a genre name doesn't describe any gameplay features at all, we still sort games into genres based on the things that they share. So this is just me, but I don't have a problem with the term Metroidvania. I think it's a perfectly acceptable way of describing games that were specifically created to mimic the mechanics of Metroid or Castlevania. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there who think that giving game genres intelligent-sounding names will legitimize the medium, as if renaming Metroidvania to something smart will make video games a field worthy of study like books or movies. To be fair, I don't blame people who feel that way because we live in a time where video games are still seen as a mind-numbing time sink, and people who play video games are stigmatized as being immature at best or antisocial at worst. But here's the thing, giving a genre some fancy academic name isn't going to change old people's perception of video games. Take it from me, if you need other people's approval to validate your chosen hobby or profession, you got much bigger problems. Even though I don't think a rename is explicitly necessary, whether I like it or not, it's gonna happen. So I thought it was a good idea to get ahead of this thing before we had a whole ass disaster on our hands. In an alternate timeline, some idiot started calling Metroidvanias hidey-findies, and that universe never recovered. In Japan, Metroidvanias are known as search action games, and there are a lot of people in English-speaking countries that have fully embraced this term. I think it works pretty well too. An action game where you search for stuff. Doesn't get any simpler than that, right? So if search action resonates with you, go forth and conquer. I did a quick Google search for search action, and I was surprised to find out that a lot of people on this side of the world had a similar idea. One term I thought was really cool was exploration action. Exploration for short. That's another really elegant solution, and I wouldn't mind at all if the industry moved in that direction. Personally though, I think putting the word action at the end of a genre name should be avoided as much as possible, because action game is an umbrella term that covers everything from Street Fighter to Tetris, and even though a genre name doesn't have to describe every gameplay mechanic, you should at least try to nail the most important one. 𝗀𝗵cie𝘄𝑵 and Jack Packard from The Escapist started calling Metroidvanias sprawlers, but I wasn't able to find a source that explained why. Here's Packard explaining why he thought Metroidvania needed to be renamed in the first place.
You and I very recently have finally dethroned the Metroidvania moniker with our very own Sprawler, a much more elegant genre name that doesn't rely on your knowledge of Metroid or Castlevania.
In other words, we need a new name because it's difficult for newcomers to understand what the genre's about unless they were already familiar with both Metroid and Castlevania. And that's a perfectly altruistic reason to give a genre a new name. A good genre name should give you at least a hint of what the gameplay consists of. In a shooter, you bust caps. In a fighting game, you square up. In an RPG, you put on your robe and wizard hat. So, what the hell do you do in a sprawler? I don't think I've ever really sprawled before. Honestly, I don't think I want to either. 𝗀𝗵cie just so happens to be a brilliant game designer in his own right, which makes this attempt all the more confusing. Listen, 𝗀𝗵cie, I'm a huge fan, but we can do better. I'm doing my best not to drag this out, but there's one last thing I gotta mention. I think it's perfectly acceptable for a single genre to have multiple names. Most game genres already have multiple names depending on what part of the world you're in. Scrolling shooter and shmup both refer to the same thing, and there are definitely genres out there like survival horror that don't refer to any gameplay mechanics whatsoever. So if you don't like any of the options you see here, there's nothing wrong with branching out and finding your own path. Alright, you ready for the big reveal? Hey, give me a drum roll. What drum? We don't have any drums. Well, what do you got? Let me see. 416. Betamax? Naturally. Bring the noise. Mapformer. It's a platformer with a map that you form by platforming. Hit me like a brick when it popped into my head, but truth be told, even I wasn't convinced it was a good idea. That is until one of my producers conducted a little experiment on his Twitch channel. Shout out to Cyber for being so skeptical. Maybe you can help me out and recreate the experiment yourself. Here's what you do. Tell people the word Mapformer and ask them to name a game they think would fit into that genre. If people respond with games like SimCity or Minecraft, then I know I gotta go back to the drawing board. Based on what I've seen so far though, I got a feeling most people are gonna get it immediately. So I'm sitting there, feeling like a badass, patting myself on the back for accomplishing what people have been trying to do for years. Then it was brought to my attention that the term Mapformer has actually been around for a while now. The first reference I was able to find dates all the way back to 2017. Needless to say, I was pretty devastated by this revelation, but I think there's a silver lining in there somewhere. My guess is this is all just a bad case of cryptomnesia. That's when you see something in passing, but you forget about it, so when you finally dig it out of your random access memory, you think it's an original idea. But it's also possible that I came up with the term Mapformer independently because it's the most logical solution. Highly improbable, but it's definitely plausible. Either way, until I come up with something better, I think Mapformer is the best option we got so far. It's a play on words that iterates on an established genre, and it works on multiple levels, because not only does it represent map-based platformer, but it also lets you know that you form the map by playing. Ah, but damn it. I already told all my enemies that I renamed a genre. I even made a theme song to get it stuck in people's heads. Mapformer, they got themselves a right to fight with cred. I look right boom boom down, take the missile back and get the screw attack and load my debris. I look right boom boom down. This sucks. If I ever want to show my mask in the underworld again, I gotta find a way to salvage my reputation. For the record, if you've been looking for a replacement for Metroidvania, I fully endorse Mapformer. But for the purposes of this video, I came up with another new genre name, and I don't recommend using this term at all. This is just what I'm gonna be using from now on.
Retro Mapper.
As you can see, it's an acronym. If you want the full explanation for what each of these letters stands for, skip to the end. But if you want to know what inspired me to create this monstrosity, let's take a look at the history and design of the Retro Mapper to boil it down to its baser elements. After all, the best way to name a genre is to identify the mechanics that are essential for it to exist. Technically, the creator of this genre was a game called Brain Breaker, released for the Sharp X1 in 1985. But what in the shit is a Sharp X1? We could probably just skip this one. The first popular game to establish the conventions of the Retro Mapper was the original Metroid back in 1986. When the game starts, your instincts tell you to move right to progress, like most side-scrollers of the time, but eventually you get to a point where you can't go forward no matter what you do. If you look at the environment, you might think you could fit through this tight space if you could make yourself just a little bit smaller, but either way, you're at a dead end. The only thing you can do is go back to where you started. This time though, you go left, and that's when you discover Metroid's first and most iconic power-up, the Morph Ball. Using this, you can shrink yourself down to exactly the right size to get past the obstacle you encountered earlier. That's how Metroid taught players its most important mechanic. Sometimes you have to go back in order to move forward. Another thing players would have noticed about this game was its labyrinthine level design. Metroid's environments weren't a linear point A to point B affair like a lot of other games of the time. Instead, players were given a complex world they could explore at will. Finishing the game required players to get intimately acquainted with the game's setting by backtracking through the levels. Unfortunately, acclimating yourself to Metroid's environment was easier said than done, because the game didn't include a map to help players navigate. But some form of map was an absolute requirement to finish the game, so players who wanted to see the ending had a few choices when it came to cartography. The cheapest option was a mental map. After playing the game long enough, players would grow accustomed to the levels the same way they would the streets of their neighborhood. More resourceful or more impatient players would bust out the graph paper and map the game by hand. Back in the 80s and even well into the 90s, taking meticulous notes was seen as part of the experience. So in games like Metroid, drawing your own atlas made you feel like you were a brave adventurer mapping uncharted territory. For a more legitimate solution though, some lucky gamers were able to get their hands on this, the official Nintendo Player's Guide. This sacred tome gave people a complete map of all the levels that players could refer to during gameplay. It wasn't until the third game in the Metroid series was released in 1994 that players were given a map they could access at the press of a button. The map was so essential to the experience that a miniature version of it was visible at all times on the heads-up display. The minimap completely altered Metroid's gameplay loop because it gave you a clear picture of all the areas you had left to explore. But it's not like having a map made the game too easy, because there were all kinds of hidden areas that could only be discovered through experimentation. So if you wanted to see everything the game had to offer, you had to think outside the box and use the tools you were given in creative ways. 3 years later, Symphony of the Night iterated on Super Metroid's map design to set itself apart. Castlevania's map was unique in that, unlike Metroid, you weren't given a general layout at the start. The only way you could reveal sections of the map was by going to places you hadn't explored before. It was kinda like the Fog of War system you see in most RTS games. Not all the games in the Castlevania series after Symphony of the Night followed this formula, but the ones that did came to be known as 𝗚𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 Metroidvania, because even though Super Metroid laid the majority of the groundwork, 𝗀𝗵𝗄𝗀 distinguished themselves in a subtle way. Because of that, when developers of future games set out to make a retro mapper, they had two similar but distinct schools of thought to take inspiration from. Personally, I think the map has to be the #1 most integral aspect of the genre. Obviously, the original Metroid didn't have a map at all, so you could argue that it's possible to make a retro mapper without one, but there just aren't any games being made in this genre that don't take their mechanics from either Super Metroid or Symphony of the Night. Even Axiom Verge, whose pixel art style is lifted directly from the original Metroid, includes a minimap. Not only that, but it's a Fog of War style map like Symphony of the Night. So I'm gonna make a judgment call and say the map is non-negotiable. But not just any map. It has to be a complex, interconnected maze that encourages players to explore. If it doesn't have that, then at best a game can only be considered to have retro mapper elements. But a big fancy map don't mean a thing unless it's complemented by interesting ways of engaging with that world. Retro mappers do this in two ways. The first is by giving players a variety of mobility options. These are moves like sprinting, double jumps, or the almighty grappling hook. But you don't have access to everything at first. These abilities have to be introduced gradually as rewards for exploration, which then gives the player more incentive to get their spelunking on. Dropping a hint at how powerful you can become before snatching it all away was another psychological trick that encouraged players to recapture their lost glory. Which brings me to the second way retro mappers allow players to engage with the world: raw firepower. Enhancing the player's offensive capabilities also enhance their ability to interact with the environment, whether that's dealing more damage to enemies or using high explosives to make your own damned ore. TV Tropes actually has a page dedicated to this concept called Ability Required to Proceed, but an important clarification has to be made. Your ability to progress can't be abstracted behind a statistic on a character screen or something like that. To me, a retro mapper needs to have obstacles that can only be overcome by a specific action. In other words, your movements and attacks are keys that unlock doors throughout the map. Apparently, the Ability Required to Proceed trope began in 1991 with A Link to the Past, which it turns out was Koji Igarashi's main inspiration for Symphony of the Night. Super Metroid was released 3 years after Link to the Past, so I can't imagine Metroid's design wasn't also influenced by Legend of Zelda. And that led to a scary realization. If the two games that solidified Metroidvania as a genre were both derived from Link to the Past, what do Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night bring to the table? Because it seems like what people have been calling Metroidvania all this time is just Zelda 2 with more backtracking. So now I gotta double check. Do we really need a separate genre to describe platformers with some puzzle solving and an auto map? Because that's all a Metroidvania is. Again, since all the games in this genre are trying to evoke the specific style of map-based action-adventure popularized by Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night, I don't see anything wrong with calling it like it is. But if you're the type of person who just can't leave well enough alone like I am, well, it turns out we've had a proper name for this genre for the past 5 years. It just never caught on. It's called platform adventure, which is technically even more accurate than Mapformer. Since platformers are a subgenre of action games, platform adventure is the perfect description of an action-adventure game with a heavy focus on platforming. Looking at it from that perspective, the only thing that Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night added to the platform adventure genre was the auto map. That just barely warrants a genre name. But like I said before, having access to that map completely changed how the game was played. So I'd be willing to go out on a limb and say that the retro mapper is a subgenre of platform adventure. I feel like an idiot for not realizing it sooner, but in my defense, this rabbit hole goes crazy deep, so I'm gonna wrap this up. If you thought Metroidvania needed a smart-sounding genre name, now you got several options. Platform adventure, search action, Mapformer, hidey-findy, take your pick. I'm gonna call it a retro mapper. Retro is in the original Latin root, meaning go back. In other words, you backtrack to map out the environment around you. Along the way, you find power-ups to enhance your movement capabilities, weapons to increase your arsenal, and other cool stuff like, what is that, a friggin' turkey leg? Oh, hell yeah! Anyway, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, you know how a lot of game genres are abbreviations? Well, I got me an acronym of my own. Retro mapper. Retread and explore to reach overwhelming mobility, attack power, and progressively enticing rewards.
Well, you definitely nailed the part about reaching.
I'm gonna ignore that. Look, it's not like I'm trying to push this on the video game industry. I really don't care if anybody else uses it. Actually, you know what? Nobody else is allowed to use it. How about that? This is just for me.
You want my property? You can't have it.
If you want to see more breakdowns of retro mappers, hit the thumbs up, and if you want to see me cover some other game genres, let me know in the comments, but I'm telling you right now, it ain't gonna happen unless you support me on Patreon. Links on screen and in the description. Video's over. Go home and be a family man.